Hello, everyone. Let me know if you can hear me in the chat box, just to make sure everything is okay. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, let's get going. Today, we're going to continue what we started last time. Also, there's a chance that we do a quiz, right? Remember the format of the course. Every lecture, we flip a coin. And if it lands in your favor, then it's not a quiz. There is no quiz. If it doesn't, then there is a quiz. So I have a quiz prepared. It's on Brightspace. I'll enable it if you guys lose. So let's do this right away, see how it goes. I have actually prepared a poll. It'll be easier to tally the answers. So I'm going to launch the poll, and you guys choose, and you go ahead and fill the poll. It would be interesting if it's 50-50, then I get to choose. So your fate is in your hands right now. Okay. So it looks like most of you are leaning towards heads. So heads, no quiz. Tails, there's a quiz. Okay? Let's see how that goes. So heads, no quiz. It's your lucky day. Okay, let's see. Share screen. Share. Okay, so let's do this. Heads, no quiz. Okay? No quiz today. Okay, so hopefully it'll be next time. So you guys got lucky. Okay, no quiz for today. We'll just do the lecture. And whatever questions I had prepared for today, they're not going to go away. I'm just going to add more for next week. Okay. Any questions before we start the lecture? See the chat. Yeah, people are happy. That's good. I'm glad you're happy. That's good. So yeah, any questions before we start in, regarding assignment 2 or any of the material? If there are no questions, I'll start the lecture. So yes. Yeah, the quiz would be on the previous lecture, not one lecture, on the previous material since the last quiz. So next time, for instance, for the quiz, it would cover everything since the last quiz. Since we've never done the quiz, any quiz would be pretty much everything we've seen. So it's like the lottery. The jackpot becomes bigger and bigger, right? Except the jackpot in this case is actually you having to study more. So for next lecture, the quiz would cover everything we've seen in the course. And then once we do the quiz, then the quiz after that is just the last stuff, the material we've seen since the last quiz. Okay, so for instance, for next week, if we have a quiz, it'll cover the first chapter we've seen, and it will cover what we've seen last week and what we'll see today. Oh yeah, good question. Have we started the yes? So I was gonna announce. Thank you for reminding me. As soon as we end this lecture, registration starts. Okay. So once we say, "I'll see you next week," that's when we open registration, and then you can start shooting your emails. Okay. So registration starts as soon as we end this lecture.
Hello, Professor.
Hi.
I have a question about the first assessment, and I finished it and I test the similarity. One thing make me confused is that I just copied your questions, such as describing the usefulness of the effective computing, just the questions, but the similarity of the questions is high up to 5%. Is that
Yeah, I'll tell you why. Because uh, these questions are already in the database. Because another student might have also copied the questions, because it compares your assignment to the web and also to other students' assignments. but
Okay.
but that's not something you need to worry about. So that's why I say the percentage is not the whole story. It's not like we'll see, oh, there's a high percentage, that means there's a problem. No, we see it, we see a high percentage, then we look at the report and see what is the problem. Is it a real problem, or is it a false alarm? A lot of the times it's false alarm. So a high percentage doesn't necessarily mean it's a problem. And 5% is a low percentage. But anyway, even a higher percentage doesn't necessarily mean it's a problem. So we have to look at the report.
Okay. But by the way, may I ask, need we have a topic, we made a topic for every asset, or we can just use your questions? Need a topic.
Oh, for you mean, can you choose your own topic, or do you have to stick to my topics? Is that the question?
No, I mean that when we write the short essay, need we just give it a name for the as one and the second essay, or needn't we? We can just start to write the main body.
Oh, is that for assignment 1 or for assignment 2?
Assignment one.
Oh, so it doesn't matter. It doesn't,
Okay.
as long as you answer the questions, it doesn't matter.
Okay. Thank you.
Both are fine. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, great. So uh, I said we open registration right after this lecture. That means during the break, when we have a break, this is a good time to discuss with your team members, if you haven't already done so, which topic you would like to choose. Okay, still admitting some students. Okay, so let's start the material. So last time we were talking about effect modalities. We talked about effect models and modalities, and in terms of modalities, we were not done. We talked about the visual modality, facial expression, body expression. In terms of audio, we talked about speech semantics. That's where we stopped last time. And we talked about natural language processing in terms of assessing speech sentiment, and we looked at the various features that are typically used to achieve that. In particular, we took a bit of time to talk about word embeddings, and we stopped here at speech intonation. So speech intonation has to do with the tone, right? This is what we've mentioned since this first lecture. So speech intonation corresponds to the variation in the spoken pitch. We tend to vary the pitch to convey lots of information regarding emotions. It's quite reflective of emotions. Sometimes it's not about what we say, but just how we say it contains a lot of emotional information. We can say exactly the same thing, just varying the pitch, varying the tone will make a huge difference in terms of the emotional information we're encoding into the speech. Speech intonation analyzers ignore the meaning of messages. They're not focused on the meaning of the message, but they're looking at other acoustic cues that reflect emotions. So here's the general process of how speech and intonation analysis works. It's basically, I'm going to summarize it into 3 simple steps. The first step is pre-processing, and that really applies to any time you're dealing with any signal. Enhance denoise, especially with speech signals. You wanna try to de-reverberate depending on where the speech was recorded, what kind of room, what kind of microphone technology. The speech signal might be of low quality and you want to do some pre-processing on it. A little bit of pre-processing can go a long way in terms of getting rid of unwanted artifacts in your signal. Then you extract some features. When it comes to speech, we call them low-level descriptors using windowing functions. So let me just explain briefly what I mean by a windowing function. So a windowing function would look like this. Let's say this is my speech waveform. This is my speech waveform. Just I'm sure you've seen recorded speech and how it looks like. There's some. It looks roughly like this. And what I can do is, in order to extract features from that speech waveform, I'll cut it into segments. We call them windows. Okay, these windows are typically between 10 to 30 milliseconds in length. And so I would cut this speech signal into windows, and for each window I would calculate some features that might help me recognize emotion. Sometimes the windows are overlapping if we want to increase the amount of features we estimate. So instead of waiting, let's say 30 milliseconds before we analyze the next window, we can overlap them. So they go like this. 50% overlap, 70% overlap. So they're kind of overlapping, but that's not too important. But the idea is that you take the speech signal and you segment it and you calculate the features for each segment. And then the features that you calculate for each segment, you use them to classify using machine learning algorithm. Now, these features, we call them LLDs or low-level descriptors. There are many LLDs that can be extracted from a speech signal, such as pitch, and in particular the fundamental frequency. If anybody has any experience in audiology, they would be familiar with the fundamental frequency, is referred to as F0. The energy just refers to how loud the voice is. MFCCs, and they reflect some spectral information. I'm not going to get into MFCCs. I'll talk about the pitch and fundamental frequency, talk about the energy, but just I don't want to dive too deeply into signal processing and audiology concepts. Typically, what you do in effective computing is you use a library. There are some very popular libraries. One of them is called OpenSmile. So there are libraries that are really good at extracting features for you. And typically what you do is you extract as many features as you can and run a feature selection algorithm. I'll mention a little bit more about these feature selection algorithms later on to figure out what features are the most useful. Okay, so you don't really have to dive too deeply into what these features represent, as long as you know these are features that are typically used in effective computing applications, and we can extract them and we can figure out which ones would be more useful for our particular problem. If you want to dive too deeply, then you need to have a little bit of background in signal processing. But I'll just talk about the fundamental frequency because that's one of the simpler ones. So when it comes to fundamental frequency, in order to define or describe what fundamental frequency is, I have to take a step back and just explain a few general concepts about how speech is generated by human beings and other animals. So sounds generated by humans are filtered by the shape of their vocal tract, okay? Including and most prominently the tongue and the teeth. Our tongue and teeth, we use them quite effectively in order to modulate how we pronounce letters or how we produce certain sounds. So the shape and the shape of the vocal tract as modulated by the tongue and teeth determines what kind of sound comes out when we're speaking. So let me define two types of sounds: the obstruent sound and the sonorant sound. So the obstruent sound is a speech sound made by obstructing a lot of the airflow using the tongue and the teeth, like the F in flowers and S in sound. And just think about it when you lose a tooth, when you're younger and you lose a tooth, especially one of these front teeth, it's hard to say the S sound because you're having a hard time obstructing the airflow, right? You have a gap and it sounds like F instead of S because you lost some of you lost a tooth that you normally use to modulate the vocal tract. So these are obstruents. Sonorants, it's a speech sound made by continuous and mostly non-obstructed airflow. Okay, so you're going to not block, you're going to try to move the teeth and the tongue out of the way so you're not blocking a lot of the airflow. And that's how you produce this M, let's say in Emily, or N in Logan. So I mentioned all of that to tell you that obstruents, sonorants, and vowels, everybody knows what vowels are, don't need to define them, in human speech are periodic. So that's a really interesting feature. And periodic, and their period depends on the pitch. So each of the repeating patterns, as you can see here, you can probably see how periodic this is a diagram of a vowel, somebody just pronouncing a vowel. You see, it's kind of repeating, right? Each of the repeating patterns is called a cycle. So cycle duration is called pitch period length, and it's defined as T0, and the inverse of that would be the fundamental frequency, which is F0. And that really depends on the pitch, right? You can say exactly the same vowel, but at different pitches, like, oh, that's a low pitch. Oh, that's a high pitch. I'm not the best one to do that, but you kind of get the idea. And so pitch can be calculated by looking, or can be inferred by looking at the fundamental frequency. And by doing that, you're extracting important information about the pitch and the tone, which is quite reflective of emotions. Energy is simply calculated using this formula. Just you take the signal. So let's say I take the speech signal, and I take all the points in the speech signal, get the absolute value, square it, and sum them all. So I'm getting basically the square of the integral under this curve. And that gives me how much energy there's in the speech, how loud it is. Okay. Any questions so far? Physiological modality. So physiological signals can be used for affect recognition through the detection of some biological patterns. Whether these biological patterns are the source of the emotion or are a reflection of the emotion, whether Cannon Bard is true or James Lang is true, whether there's a hybrid phenomenon going on, regardless of the nature of emotions, we know that there are biological patterns associated with emotions. And so by monitoring these biological patterns, we can infer information about emotions. And so that's the idea of using the physiological modality, because we know our biology is affected by how we are feeling. If we're scared, our heart rate goes up. Everybody knows that, right? We know emotions affect biological processes. So let's look at these biological processes and see how we can get information about the emotions. So typical physiological signals that can be analyzed are ECG, that refers to electrocardiography, that's the electrical activity of the heart. EMG, electromyography. EEG, a term that nobody knows if you want to, if everybody just uses the acronym. Skin conductance, also known as galvanic skin response or electrodermal activity. So if you read older papers on affective computing, you'll see them mention galvanic skin response. If you read newer papers, you'll see them talk about skin conductance. They mean exactly the same thing. Respiration rate. So these are typically most of the time what the types of physiological signals that we measure in order to infer emotion, in order to recognize the emotion of individuals. Now, these signals are typically collected through non-invasive sensors. You don't want to use invasive sensors for affective computing. This is not a medical application. I mean, you can have affective computing used in psychology, but typically, you don't want to use non-invasive sensors that are affixed to the body of the subject in order to measure these signals. So we'll look at these signals and we'll look at what kind of information they can reflect. We'll start with ECG. So now we're going to do a little bit of biology. This is really as interdisciplinary as it gets, okay? So we're going to look at a little bit of biology because it's really important to the understanding of how we can extract information from physiological signals. So ECG is a signal, without doubt, you've seen somewhere. Either you've seen the real signal, or you've seen one of those fake signals they use in movies, and the fake ones look something like this, where there's like something, and then it goes up. But this is really what it should look like. There's more detail than what the movies will show you. So it looks like this, and we have a name for each feature in an ECG signal. So this little bump here, that's called the P wave. It's called the Q wave, S wave, R peak, T wave. There's a question, would you consider a wearable invasive for effective computing? I wouldn't, but I mean, you never know what researchers propose. But I definitely wouldn't. I would think it's bordering on unethical. I'm a bit also even wary of the practicality of using wearable sensors for effective computing applications. Nowadays, more and more people are willing to wear wearable sensors. Um, but some of the applications, let's say they require an EEG sensor to measure the electrical activity of the brain. I'm not sure I'm a big proponent of these applications because they require to wear something all day. So I'm not even comfortable with wearables, let alone invasive sensors. So I wouldn't go there. I wouldn't do research there, but it wouldn't be unusual to find a paper somebody proposed something like that. But definitely it's not something that you're going to see commercialized anytime soon. It's just not practical. So yeah, so these are the various features of the ECG signal, okay? And it repeats, it's a cyclical signal. Now, has anybody by any chance built just, as a university project or a high school project, built their own ECG machine? They're really not difficult to build. Anybody's give it a shot? Anybody has ever been interested? Because this is something I've done. That's why I'm asking. So building these ECG machines, it's really simple. You can build one in less than $20. You just need a bunch of electronic components. And the idea here is that you're going to try to read an electrical signal from the body and amplify it as much as possible and send it to a computer or a microcontroller. So building ECG machines is really simple. Getting these signals is really simple. Here's the tough part. If you notice, all these letters P, Q, S, and T, they represent features that are quite subtle, okay? And they can be easily drowned by noise, right? Especially if you're using a cheap ECG machine like the one I would build, just using pennies for electrodes and a really tiny electronic circuit. That's not really going to take you to, very far in terms of getting you accurate picture of the P, Q, S, and T features. But there's one feature that no matter how bad your ECG machine is, it's always obvious. If you're getting an ECG signal, you're going to see that feature unless you're doing something wrong. And that is the R peak. So it's a really obvious feature, these R peaks. And that is why we rely on these R peaks to calculate heart rate. All I have to do is count how many R peaks, and these are really obvious, right? They're shooting up. It's an impulse. It's high. It's really easy to detect it. It's not going to be easily drowned by noise. And so, if you count the number of R peaks per minute, then you have the heart rate. And so this is typically how we get the heart rate if we're using EEG. Now, the interval between two successive R peaks is called R to R interval. Okay, so that's the interval between two successive R peaks. Now, the R peaks represents the depolarization of the ventricles. If you're interested in how the heart works, you can take a look at it. It's a really interesting electrical machine. The heart is an electrical machine at the end of the day. And yeah, just as I mentioned, by relying on these little R peaks, you see this is an ECG signal that you would get in real life. You see, especially from a cheap sensor. This one's collected with a really cheap sensor that I used. And so what you see here is that the R peak is obvious, and the other features are not that obvious. But all I have to do is just count these, and I get the heart rate. And if I measure the distance or the time interval between successive R peaks, I get R to R intervals. Now, as it turns out, the R to R intervals are even more important than the heart rate. So if we get this, a sequence of all R to R intervals, we get a signal that we call heart rate variability. It's just reflecting how much your heart rate is varying. If the R to R interval is more or less constant, then heart rate variability is low. If the R to R peaks and the R to R interval is the variation between the R to R intervals is high, that means the heart rate variability is high. So let's say between these two peaks, we have 600 milliseconds, and here we have 900, 800, 400. That's a bit exaggerated, but you can see this is all over the place. There's a lot of variability. However, if it's 600, then 65, then 599, that's low variability, okay? So that's what we call heart rate variability. So to get heart rate variability, we get an ECG signal, and from the ECG signal, we calculate the R to R intervals, and the R to R intervals are plotted in the time domain, and then we can convert them to the frequency domain. And if you're not familiar with that, don't worry about it. I'm just telling you, when you get a signal in the time domain, you can convert it to the frequency domain to get an alternative view of the signal. And then from the time domain representation and the frequency domain representation, you can get a variety of features. Now, let me ask you a question. If we go back here, I talked about the variability. Do you think if your heart rate is varying a lot, that means the R to R intervals are varying a lot, they're all over the place, do you think that's healthy or unhealthy? Just let me know in the chat box. What do you think? Yeah. So I got two answers: unhealthy, healthy. Yeah, I know you don't know. I'm just, so intuitively, it feels like it should be unhealthy, right? But it's actually quite healthy and normal. In fact, if your R to R intervals are constant all the time, there's a problem. Now, if they are somewhat constant and you are in a stressed out state, that's normal. Typically, your heart rate variability goes up. That means it varies a lot when you are in a more relaxed state. If you start exercising or if you are scared, then your heart rate becomes more periodic and the R to R interval becomes a bit more constant. So it is not abnormal. In fact, when you're really having a good time watching a movie, having a good time really relaxed, your R to R intervals are varying quite a bit. And that's normal. And that's why we look at heart rate variability, because the variability is telling us something and can tell us something about the emotions. Okay. So typically the type of features that you would want to extract, the heart rate. Obviously, you want to extract the heart rate, and that's something that everybody understands. Heart rate goes up if you're scared, but it also goes up if you're moving around. So you have to be careful about that, right? You want to isolate the source of the increase in the heart rate. Is it because somebody's moving around? You typically have an accelerometer on board of the ECG sensor. Vast majority of ECG sensors that are used for fitness or used for in effective computing applications have an accelerometer on board, so to rule out movement. Your heart rate goes up, you're sitting in front of your computer, chances are, yeah, you're a bit stressed or you're unhealthy. But most likely, there's stress. There's an emotional source to that increase in the heart rate. SDNN, standard deviation of the normal to normal. Normal to normal is another word for R to R. Normal to, it's in some books they call it normal to normal. Normal heartbeat to normal heartbeat. or R peak to R peak, as opposed to an abnormal or premature beat. So there are, it's normal to normal. That means normal to normal beat. And so it's another term for R to R interval. So standard deviation of the R to R interval. So if I get the standard deviation of the signal, that gives me SDNN. RMSSD, that's the root mean square of successive differences, the successive differences between the RR intervals. You get the root mean square. I'm just mentioning them. I wouldn't ask you about these in a quiz. I'm just mentioning them quickly. I'm not going to mention all of them also. And N50, that's the number of pairs of successive RR intervals that differ by more than 50 milliseconds, right? You have one RR interval is 600, the next one is 650. Okay, so you count that. Next one is 662, you don't count that. So then number of successive RR intervals that differ by more than 50 milliseconds. That reflects, there's a lot of variation. And in the frequency domain, you divide the frequency domain into some frequencies, most prominently the low frequency, and that's the range, and the high frequency, and also you calculate the ratio between low frequency and high frequency. Okay, so low frequency, high frequency, and low frequency over high frequency. So I'm saying all of that. There's a point why I'm saying all of that. Okay, I don't want to lose you. So stick with me. Okay, now in order to understand why I'm talking about all of this, we need to talk a little bit about the autonomic nervous system. Okay, very briefly. So the nervous system can be divided into two branches: central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system has the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, that's your brain, that's your spinal cord, that's the central nervous system. Peripheral nervous system can be divided into somatic and autonomic nervous system. Somatic is associated with voluntary control. This is how you control your muscles, right? If I move my hand, this is voluntary. This is not involuntary. Autonomic nervous system are the things that run on their own, right? It controls the things that run on their own. Like you don't tell your heart to beat. That would be quite annoying. If you forget to tell your heart to beat, you're in trouble, right? So it's running on its own. Breathing is, you can take control, but also if you don't take control, it runs on its own. Digestive system, sweat glands, right? Lots of biological processes are controlled by the autonomic nervous system that does not require you to voluntarily control something, okay? Now, the autonomic nervous system can be further divided into the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. I don't remember if I talked about sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, but I'm going to mention them. So, you are walking in the woods and you encounter a bear, and you are afraid of bears. Let's assume, which is the vast majority of people. Some people are not. Vast majority of people are afraid of bears. So you encounter a bear, you're kind of freaking out, okay? And so what happens in this case? The sympathetic nervous system gets activated. So sympathetic nervous system is activated when you're in danger, when you're scared, when you're nervous, when you're stressed. Parasympathetic nervous system is the opposite. It's activated when you're relaxed, when you're meditating, when you're having good night of sleep, and you sleep. You're not seeing it. You're not seeing a nightmare. You're just having a pleasant dream. So that's the parasympathetic nervous system, when things are going well. And we're going to see that the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous systems control your body based on what you're experiencing. And if we then monitoring your body's biological processes, we can infer some information about your emotions. So if I cannot tap directly into the sympathetic nervous system or parasympathetic nervous system, what I need to do is tap into what they control. I know the autonomic nervous system controls the heart, and that means the sympathetic nervous system will increase your heart rate, will make your heart rhythm more regular if you are scared, if you are stressed, if you are anxious, because the sympathetic nervous system does that. And so If I monitor the heart, I can infer information about the sympathetic nervous system, which further tells me information about your emotional status. If your heart rate variability is varying quite drastically, that means the parasympathetic nervous system is more in charge. So they're always fighting for control over you, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, and the balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system is what gives me information about your emotional status, and that balance is reflected in the biological processes. So let me give you an example. For instance, when your sympathetic nervous system is activated, it dilates the pupils. That's probably an evolutionary response to focus on a threat. You know, there's a bear, I need to focus. I need to see very well if there are other bears that are coming with it. Is there an escape route? All right, so dilates the pupils. So parasympathetic does the opposite, constricts the pupils, because you really don't need to focus. Let's just relax things. Sympathetic nervous system inhibits saliva production. That's why when you have a presentation or you're nervous, your mouth dries, right? Yeah, that's because the sympathetic nervous system is inhibiting saliva production. Your body's not producing saliva, so your mouth gets dry. And why does that happen? Most likely a reason is because the sympathetic nervous system is trying to shut down all non-necessary functions. Saliva production is not necessary when there's a bear in front of you, right? So when you're in danger, when the fight or flight response is activated, saliva production is not going to ensure your survival. So let's shut it down. Let's spend any energy, any ounce of energy we have on something that is more needed. For instance, sympathetic nervous system dilates the bronchioles. Okay, the bronchioles are in your lungs. I'm going to talk about them in a second, and they allow you to breathe faster. That's why when you're nervous, you start breathing faster. Okay, because the reason why you breathe faster is because you want to get more oxygen into your system, because you need that oxygen to run away from the bear or fight the bear. Neither are a good idea, by the way. Raises the heart rate, so you're pumping more oxygen into the body, sending oxygen everywhere. Inhibits the activity of the digestive organs, because you really don't need to digest at the moment. This is not the best time to spend energy on digestion. Let's spend the energy on running away or fighting. Inhibits the gallbladder, so all non-necessary functions. It relaxes urinary bladder, and that's an unfortunate side effect of activating the sympathetic nervous system. You see somebody that is very nervous and things happen, right? So that's what the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems do in terms of biological processes. So by looking at some of these biological processes, we can get some information about emotions. Let's go back to heart rate variability. So the heart rate is controlled by the ANS, autonomic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system excites the heart. Parasympathetic nervous system inhibits the heart, slows down your heart rate. You don't really need to pump a lot of oxygen-rich blood into the body. Slow things down. There's no threat. Life is good. That's what the parasympathetic nervous system is doing. Sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems operate in opposition to each other. Okay, sympathetic nervous system is responsible for the fight or flight response. Parasympathetic nervous system takes over during times of stress-free relaxation. So the balance between them creates variability in the heart rate. Okay, so let's go back to our features. We know if stress increases, heart rate increases, unless you're exercising. But exercise is a physical stress. But if you're not exercising, or if you're not engaging in a highly physical activity, then there's only one other source, and that is emotion. If we rule out pathologies, we're not talking about pathologies in this case. This is completely outside of the scope of this analysis. But if we rule out pathologies, your heart rate goes up, you're not engaged in a physiological activity, in a physical activity, chances are you're stressed, right? There's only one other source. And also the standard deviation of normal to normal decreases when stress increases. In terms of frequency domain, which is really what most people focus on because it's far more reflective of stress and anxiety compared to the time domain features. The high frequency component reflects the parasympathetic nervous system activity. That's why the frequency domain is so important. The high frequency component of the heart rate variability is actually giving you an insight about the activity of the parasympathetic nervous system. It's quite fascinating. So by monitoring this frequency band, you're actually figuring out what the parasympathetic nervous system is doing. So if this frequency band goes down, and what I mean by frequency band is when you get the frequency domain representation of the signal, you calculate the interval under specific frequency ranges. So that's the integral on this under frequency ranges that gives you these features. Okay, so if the high frequency goes down, that means parasympathetic nervous system is not as active, which means the sympathetic nervous system is active. Because if parasympathetic nervous system is not active, the other one is active. If high frequency goes up, that means your parasympathetic nervous system is getting activated. Also, the low frequency over high frequency tends to reflect the activity of the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so monitoring any of these or both of them will give you very interesting information about your autonomic nervous system. That's why heart rate variability is so fascinating. It's especially in the frequency domain. It's giving you a window into the activity of the autonomic nervous system. Any questions? Yes.
Could you go back to the last page?
Yes.
Okay, I would like to talk about the low frequency and the high frequency, the comparison between them. So if the low frequency is more than the high frequency, that means our stress is increased.
Yes. Yes.
It made me confused here. I think high frequency means more stress.
No. Why would you say so?
Yes. I didn't got it. Why?
So why are you saying if the high frequency
It's relaxed in your point.
Yes. So if the high frequency, that band is is reflecting information about the activity of the parasympathetic nervous system. So when it's higher in that range, in that particular range, forget the names. That particular range tends to reflect the activity of the parasympathetic nervous system. So when it's higher, then there's a stress decrease, and when it's lower, there's a stress increase.
So the high frequency means the high frequency of the heart rate or anything else?
No, not the heart rate. The heart rate variability. So okay. Now I understand why you got confused. So if we're talking about the high frequency of the heart rate, that means the heart cycles. That's a different story. That means if it's high frequency, that means there are the heart rate has increased, and therefore stress would increase. No, we're talking about the high frequency and the heart rate variability signal. So remember, the heart rate variability signal, we get it by looking at the R to R interval between successive R peaks. So if we get the RR interval between successive R peaks in all of our ECG record, you see these R peaks, I got the intervals between them.
Yes.
Yes. So the values of these intervals between the RR intervals, that gives me a signal, okay? So it's a sequence of numbers. I'm gonna call it a signal. That signal, I turn it into the frequency domain, and then I calculate these ranges, these frequency ranges. It's not the heart rate.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Yes. So the function of the high frequency component is well documented in the literature. It's been well documented in probably more than 500 studies that it shows that it reflects quite highly the activity of the parasympathetic nervous system. And the low to high frequency tends to the low to high frequency ratio that tends to increase with an increase of stress. And typically most studies will look at both because looking at two pieces of information gives you a better insight about the activity of the autonomic nervous system. So there's a question here says, so higher stress means higher the higher the R peaks. No. So let me just you see these R peaks? How high is decided by many factors, none of them reflect stress. It's decided by body fat, because it's decided by sensor placement. If you place the sensor closer to the heart and there's not a lot of body fat, chances are your R peak's gonna shoot up. So they're decided by many factors. None of them reflect emotions. However, the intervals between R peaks, that's really what's reflecting emotions. So not how high it is in the time domain, but the intervals between R peaks, that's what's reflecting emotions. Does that answer your question? Any other questions? So again, just to make sure everybody's on board, I'm not looking at just how many R peaks I have in a minute, and that would be the heart rate. But I'm also looking at the interval between R peaks. And I'm going to plot these. So let's say I have 600 here, 620, 580, 600 again. So what I do is plot these, okay? At time interval 1, I had, let's say this is the 600. I had a point 600. Time interval 2, I had, let's say, 620, then 580, then 600. And so that's my heart rate variability signal, right? It's very different than heart rate. That's what I take and turn into a frequency domain signal. In particular, I calculate the power spectrum density, and to be exact. Any other questions? Okay. EMG. So EMG is the electrical activity of the muscles. Again, muscles are controlled by electrical pulses that are communicated to the muscles through nerves. And so if we're monitoring the electrical activity of the muscles, we can also get some information about emotions, right? Your muscle tend to tense up when you're stressed or you're anxious, or when you're expecting a certain threat. So the electrical activity of the muscles can be quite reflective of emotions. The only downside of EMG is that you have to put these annoying EMG sensors on particular muscles. And so you can basically monitor a variety of muscles to see their electrical activity and therefore infer some information about emotions. Another thing that some researchers have explored is to put EMG sensors on the face. I don't think it's practical, but there are studies around it. And the idea is to figure out features of the facial expressions using EMG. So in particular, a lot of studies focused on the zygomaticus muscle. That's this muscle that I'm highlighting here. That's the zygomaticus muscle. And this controls smiling, right? If you're smiling or happy, there's going to be contraction here to lift your lips. And so if you monitor the electrical activity on the zygomaticus by putting an actual EMG sensor on the face, which again, not, to me, it doesn't look practical, but there are studies around it, then you can monitor facial expressions. The idea, the rationale is that cameras don't always get a clear shot of the face. You can be moving. There are all sorts of problems with detecting facial expressions from cameras. So this can be an alternative way. There's a question that says, do we have to consider the age of the person? Very good question. Yes, very good question. Do we have to consider the age of the person? Because children have a higher rate, babies have a heart rate that goes through the roof, really high heart rate. Absolutely. So here's how you would, if you want to recognize the emotion or monitor the emotions of somebody using physiological signal, in particular, if you're looking at heart rate variability. What you want to do is compare the measurements with regards to a baseline. The baseline is of that person themselves, because the heart rate variability of every single subject will be a little bit different, depending on how healthy they are, depending on their weight, depending on how often they exercise, depending on their diet, depending on their age. So what you want to do, let's say you want to develop a system that monitors the stress level, okay? So here's what you would do. You would want to collect a baseline, collect measurements where either the person is relaxed, you know they're relaxed, and you collect some measurements, or when the person is kind of in a neutral situation, they're not stressed and they're not relaxed. And then your future assessments will be relative to that original baseline. And so you're looking at a baseline associated with that person themselves. Otherwise, if you know, can train a machine learning algorithm for the heart rate variability of a group of subjects and apply it to another group of subjects, it might not work, because these physiological signals tend to be quite dependent on a variety of health factors. And so that's why it's a good idea to collect a baseline for that individual. For the EMG, it's a bit different, especially for monitoring the zygomaticus muscle. You know when the electrical activity goes up, the muscle is contracting, regardless of the biology and the health condition of the person. You can still infer some information. But heart rate variability tends to be quite dependent on health and the actual person, their age, even the biological sex of the subject can affect heart rate and heart rate variability. So it's quite dependent on a variety of factors. Any other questions? Okay. EEG, that's the electrical activity of the brain. So it's really fascinating. It sounds cooler than what it actually is, to be honest. But it's really cool, but it sounds cooler than what it actually is. So in order to understand what EEG is, we have to take a step back, talk about neurons. So a neuron is a cell within the nervous system that communicates with other cells, neural cells. So that's what your brain is made of, just a bunch of neural cells that are communicating. They're communicating using electrical pulses. So they're sending pulses between each other. And that communication between approximately 10 billion interconnected neurons in the brain, what results in all the cognitive processes. That's how we think, that's how we remember, is just a bunch of electrical signals that are exchanged between neurons. But we just have 10 billion neurons, and the complexity is absolutely tremendous. We will not develop a neural network as complex as the human brain anytime soon, most likely never. So when you see these science fiction movies warning about artificial intelligence, we're not going to get a neural network nearly as complex, as the human brain, most likely ever. So 10 billion interconnected neurons interconnected in complex ways, and they're exchanging electrical pulses. So in a perfect world, we can monitor each one of these neurons, monitor what they're doing, how they're communicating, to get a better understanding of these neuronal structures, because we have a very limited understanding because of the complexity, and because also these signals are quite minute. And so what we do in order to kind of assess the electrical activity of the brain is we look at the brain wave. And the brain wave is just like the general electrical activity of the brain that is a result of all these underlying pulses. So if I'm just looking at the general wave generated by all these underlying pulses, not looking at the underlying pulses individually, but just the overall picture, I can get some information about cognitive processes. And I can get some information about emotions. And so EEG sensors, that's what they do. They're looking at the brain waves, and when we collect these EEG signals, we tend to analyze them, analyze their frequency domain. As it turns out, through lots of experimental studies, these various frequency domain bands tend to reflect a variety of cognitive processes. So researchers divide the frequency domain of brainwaves into all these ranges. And so the first one is the infra-low wave, and that's below 0.5 hertz. That's a controversial range because it's not well understood. Most scientists think it's just noise. It's nothing important. Then you have the delta wave. I hope I'm not activating your delta wave because delta wave is associated with deep sleep and deep meditation. So if I had an EEG signal on the EEG sensor on all of your heads and I see the delta wave and also the theta wave go up, I would know that I'm in trouble because I'm just putting you to sleep, because delta wave and theta wave are both associated with sleep and meditation. Alpha wave is the one that is most useful to effective computing. It's a really famous wave. You might have heard about the alpha wave if you've ever read about EEG. So it reflects wakeful relaxation. Not when you're sleeping, when you're awake, wakeful relaxation. And so if there's a strong alpha wave, you're relaxed, life is good. If the alpha wave starts disappearing, you're anxious, you're stressed, okay? Beta wave reflects high concentration engagement, maybe a good wave to monitor for e-learning or monitor, in this remote learning environment. If your beta wave goes up and your delta wave and theta wave are going down, then I know you're concentrating engaged. And if your beta wave goes down, I know you're not concentrating and engaged. Gamma wave was once considered a noise. Today, there's no agreement about its significance. If you want to figure out what its significance is, you'll have to read a lot of the literature and it'll confuse you more than it'll give you answers because scientists just cannot agree on anything. Most scientists agree that it's not noise. They used to think it's noise. Scientists say now, no, there's some information there. They just cannot agree what it is. So still an open research question. But the alpha and beta waves are well understood through studies that have been going on since the 50s. They're quite well understood, and these are the waves that we typically use for effective computing applications. Skin conductance.
Hello, Professor.
Yes, go ahead.
I have a question on the last.
Yes.
Okay, I think you told us the lower frequency. You said before, the lower frequency means more exciting. Is that right?
This is EEG, not ECG. Now we're talking about a different signal.
Okay, they are different.
Yes, they are different. Yes. So EEG is the electrical activity of the brain.
Okay, so the high frequency of the heart means more exciting, about more relaxing. I'm sorry.
More relaxation.
Okay, they are opposites. The EEG and of the heart rate are the opposite, right?
Yeah, so for the EEG, we have these divisions and they have names. And yes, in this case, the alpha wave is reflecting relaxation, beta wave is reflecting concentration and engagement. So they're quite different because they're reflecting completely different biological processes. EEG is looking at the brain only, the other one is looking at the heart. So there's no relation, they're quite different. And also for the ECG, you're looking at an electrical pulse that is controlling what the heart does, and it's a more simple pulse, right? It's controlling how the ventricles are going to contract, and it's basically controlling the heart muscle. With the brain, you have billions of electrical pulses that are going all over the place, and you're kind of averaging all these out, and you're calling that the brain wave, and then you're calculating the frequency domain. So they're quite different. Any other questions?
Okay.
Okay. So skin conductance is basically the resistance in your skin. That's all there is to it. So what you do is, I don't know if you've done any, you've worked on any electrical circuits, but you can buy these small resistors and add them to an electrical circuit. I'm sure you've done it in high school or university. So skin conductance sensors are assuming that your skin is that resistor. Okay, so it's treating your skin as a resistor, because the drier your skin is, the higher the resistance of the skin would be. The more moist your skin is, then the lower the resistance would be. So it's actually sending an electrical pulse into your skin to measure its resistance. Now, that electrical pulse is not going to shock you. It's a really minute electrical pulse, but it goes into your skin, and this is how you calculate the resistance. The idea is that when you are nervous or scared or anxious, when your sympathetic nervous system, remember, sympathetic nervous system activates the sweat glands. When your sympathetic nervous system is active, you're going to sweat. And sweat will render your skin resistance, will lower your skin resistance. Now, the problem with skin conductance is sometimes because you sweat for all sorts of reasons other than the activation of the sympathetic nervous system. You can just be warm and your sweat glands get activated to cool down your body. That's a natural response. And so whenever you're using skin conductance, you have to be sensors, you have to be a bit careful. Usually, skin conductance sensors are used on the palm or the foot, and these are the areas that are less affected by other factors. You're less likely to sweat because of heat on your palms. That doesn't apply for everybody, but it tends to apply to a large portion of the population. You sweat in other places. And so that's why you most likely will put it on the palm or the foot. In most applications, they put it on the palm or maybe on a finger, and to get an effective view of the sweat glands activity as it relates to the sympathetic nervous system. Respiration rate. You've probably noticed when you're nervous or scared, you breathe faster. And also, if you relax, if you meditate, you're going to breathe slower. In fact, sometimes when you're scared or you're anxious, you're told to slow down your breathing, because that's kind of doing the reverse. Because when you're scared, your sympathetic nervous system gets activated, and it increases your respiration rate. It speeds up your breathing. And so what you can do, if that's a false alarm, sometimes you're scared, but you shouldn't be scared. It's a false alarm. There's no bear. You just have a presentation to give. It's not a big deal. So in order to relax yourself, you can slow down your breathing, and that kind of forces the sympathetic nervous system to back off a little bit. And so you can do that. But by default, the sympathetic nervous system will increase the respiration rate. And the idea is that when you're breathing, the air comes through your trachea and goes into the bronchial tubes. And then these bronchial tubes lead to bronchioles, which connect to alveoli. These are the air sacs that allow you to exchange the oxygen, right? They take the oxygen, they throw away all the rest of the air. You don't need it. And so what happens is that when you're stressed or anxious, the sympathetic nervous system dilates the bronchioles so that you can get in more air. And you start breathing faster, you're getting more air more quickly into your lungs, you're extracting the oxygen quickly, sending it to the heart. The heart is breathing fast, beating faster, and sending the oxygen to the muscles, because you need the energy to fight off that threat that you have. The parasympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, constricts the bronchioles. It just restricts the airflow, slows down everything. Let's take it easy. There's no need to panic. Let's just slow things down. So respiration rate refers to the number of breaths per minute. And during period of mental stress, as I mentioned, like the fight or flight response kicks in and the body needs higher intake of oxygen. This results in the dilation of the bronchioles. Okay, so these are all the modalities that I wanted to discuss. You'll find probably in the literature a few other modalities, but these are really what most researchers focus on. These are the modalities the vast majority of commercial applications in effective computing have used. And so these are the ones that I want to focus on in this course. Now, if you're collecting pieces of information from various modalities, how do you deal with that? If I was monitoring only the heart rate and the heart rate goes up, but you're not moving around, chances are I'm going to say you're stressed. But if I'm monitoring your facial expression, I'm monitoring your speech tone, I'm monitoring your heart rate variability, I'm monitoring your EEG, I'm monitoring lots of things. I have lots of sources of information. How do I put together or fuse all these pieces of information? That's what we call multimodal fusion. How do I put together all these things? And so there are a variety of ways of handling this. In particular, I'm going to describe three popular ways: feature level fusion, decision level fusion, and hybrid fusion. So let's talk about these. We'll start with feature level fusion. So remember, when I collect features from all these physiological signals, visual signals, auditory signals, I'm collecting features. I'm going to, at the end, feed all these features into a machine learning algorithm, right? Now, feature level fusion basically means that you take all the features from all the modalities, just put them in one whole set, and that's your feature set. So you have one feature set coming from all the modalities, and you're going to train your machine learning algorithm on this feature set. So this method was advocated by Pantich et al. So I have a linked reference to the study. And if you read enough about effective computing, you'll encounter the author's name, Pantich, Maya Pantich. She's one of the most prominent researchers in effective computing. And she contends that feature level fusion is the most effective way of fusing different levels of modalities. And the idea is that this is how the brain works. In the brain, we're collecting pieces of information, we're fusing them, and then making sense of all these pieces of information. We don't treat them as separate. We just get all these pieces of information and reason about these pieces of information. So let's fuse them all at the feature, meaning collect all these features and then feed them into a single machine learning algorithm. But there are difficulties with feature level fusion. Anybody that tries out feature level fusion will inevitably have some challenges. For instance, increasing the number of features without increasing the size of your data set that you're using to train your machine learning algorithm will result in decreasing the accuracy of the machine learning algorithm, will drastically affect the performance of your machine learning algorithm. That's known as the dimensionality curse. The idea is I'm increasing the number of inputs to my machine learning because I'm not dealing with one source of information like facial expression. I'm dealing with lots of sources of information, and all these sources of information are giving me features, and I'm grabbing all these features, and that's the number of features corresponds to the number of inputs, and feeding them into my machine learning algorithm. So I'm going to overwhelm the machine learning algorithm with lots of features. And so if I increase the number of inputs to my machine learning algorithm while my data set stays the same, the accuracy goes down. So if I want to keep up with the level of number of features, I have to increase my data set. So that's called dimensionality curse. So we have to be careful about that. And so that's why feature level fusion is problematic sometimes, especially if the data set is limited in size, which is almost all the time. Features from various modalities are collected at different time scales. That's also synchronization between the features is a challenge. Heart rate variability features are collected, especially frequency domain features are collected for, let's say, 3 to 5 minutes worth of data. On the other hand, for speech intonation, they're collected for 10 to 30 millisecond worth of data. So you see this discrepancy in the time scales. How do you synchronize all these features when they have different time scales? That's also another challenge for feature level fusion. Okay, so let's look at a different way of doing things. Oh, first, let me show you how the feature level fusion works. So I have different modalities of information, facial expression, hand gestures, voice signal, physiological signal. I extract features from each one of these modalities, and the set of all these features is fed to a machine learning model that will be trained on these features and eventually will be able to predict emotions. So that's how you approach it with feature level fusion. Okay. Decision level fusion. Typically, a machine learning model makes errors in some area of the feature space. And for some inputs, so when I say area in the feature space, let's say I have two features. Where's my, okay. So let's say I have two features. Feature one only, just a simplified example, feature two. So that's my feature space. In some areas of my feature space, let's say for these inputs of F1, F2, my machine learning algorithm might not be as strong because it hasn't seen a lot of examples where F1 is equal to this and F1 is equal for this point. It hasn't seen similar examples to, let's say, these points. Has seen very few examples. On the other hand, in this area, my machine learning algorithm might be strong because during training, it had a lot of examples for this area. So it kind of knows this area very well. On the other hand, for this area, for the other area, it hasn't seen a lot of examples. And so my machine learning algorithm might be weaker in some areas and stronger in some areas, okay? And so with decision level fusion, I basically use a machine learning algorithm for each modality. And that reduces the chance of problems. Why? Because one model might be weak in one area, but then another model would not have that same problem. And so they kind of cover for each other. And so that's why I can possibly get better performance. So combining multiple machine learning models can alleviate the problem of, problems in some problematic areas of the feature space. Also, this is especially true when the algorithm is operating on a different modality using a different feature space. So not only I'm using multiple machine learning algorithms, I'm using also different modalities with different feature spaces. So that also reduces the chance that I'm going to have errors in particular feature space because other algorithms will cover for that algorithm that has the problem in this particular feature area. So this decision level fusion, we use a machine learning model per modality. Each model independently estimates the emotion. So it looks like this, right? And so I have facial expression. I extract features from facial expression and I feed them to a machine learning model. And I do the same for gestures, voice, and physiological signals. And so I can have a different model for a different modalities. For instance, I can use a neural network, artificial neural network here. I can use a random forest here. I can use a decision tree. I can use SVM. It doesn't matter. Whatever works well for one particular modality. So you would train the machine learning algorithm for one modality at a time, and you obtain these different models, and then it is the output of these models that you're going to fuse. So each one of these models can predict emotions on its own. Then you're going to take all the results and then you're going to fuse them together to get your final results. So that's how decision level fusion. Decision level fusion in the literature and in commercial application tends to do far better than feature level fusion, at least for now. And the main reason is because it doesn't suffer from the problem of the limitation in the data set as much as the feature level fusion. So if your data set is limited, no problem, because you're feeding less features to each machine learning model at a time. Any questions? So the question is, there are ML models for feature level fusion, or we use one that gives the most accurate results? Are you saying that we should use a machine learning model to fuse? Is that the question?
So isn't each modality like working on separate conditions? Like these are different things, facial expression, voice signal, or the other thing. So we use one machine learning algorithm for all of them?
No.
Like how?
You train a different you train a machine learning algorithm for each one of them. Okay.
I'm talking about feature level fusion.
Oh yes, you're going to use one for all of them. So at the end of the day, features, if you can synchronize them, features are just numbers. It doesn't really matter what the source is. So the intuition behind it is that you're just feeding a bunch of numbers, and you're training the machine learning algorithm. So for this particular kind of pattern, this is what the emotion is. For this particular type of pattern, this is what the emotions is. So that's what feature level fusion does. Yeah, it kind of works, but it's not as good as decision level fusion most of the time.
I see, thanks.
Thanks. There's another question that says, does the mathematical model can really mimic the sensory system inside the human body, since we still know very little about the human body, especially the neuroscience field? Can mathematical model, that's a good question. Mathematical models can allow you to simulate if you're thinking about EEG or the neural activity of the brain, to a certain extent can allow you to simulate the brain activity. But again, the mathematical models are as good as the knowledge we have. So whenever you're trying to mathematically model something or simulate something, your simulation or your model is as good, especially if you're not using machine learning, is as good as your knowledge about that domain. That's why in a lot of situations, in recent years, we've moved away from mathematical modeling, because strict mathematical modeling requires that you understand what you're modeling. Machine learning is a model that sometimes doesn't require to fully understand what you're modeling. And so it would be hard to model something that you don't fully understand. So you can try to emulate or simulate, but you're not going to be able to create a mathematical model that gives you more understanding than you already have, because mathematical models reflect existing understanding. They're not going to give you new understanding. At least that's my take on it. Any other questions? So ML is like a black box. Yeah, ML is like a black box. I mean, that's a criticism of machine learning, is that sometimes you can treat it like a black box. And it's not politically correct to say that most of the time we treat it as a black box, because then, you're saying that you are developing a model that you don't really know how it works, and most of the time we don't. Now, there's a huge field of research that tries to shed more light on how machine learning works, especially when it comes to deep learning, because this is the most problematic area. In deep learning, we tend to treat these deep learning algorithms as black boxes. We don't know exactly how they got the answer. We just know that they got the answer. We gave them a bunch of data. We tried various things, and one of these models worked better than the others. We kind of understand why roughly it worked better than the others, but we don't know exactly how it works. And so a lot of the times we're treating it as black box. But there's a huge area of research to change that, because there are all sorts of ethical dilemmas associated with the fact that we're using these deep learning black boxes and all sorts of applications that can really affect. For instance, I'll give you an example. I don't know if I've given this example in class. There was a company that wanted to filter through CVs using artificial intelligence. So they get a lot of CVs for job postings, and typically they have managers going through CVs in order to figure out the individuals they would like to interview. Okay, so filter out some CVs that of people that they don't think are appropriate for the position. And that was taking them a lot of time and it's costing them money. So they wanted to develop a machine learning algorithm to do that. So they developed a deep learning algorithm to do that. The deep learning algorithm would extract features from the CVs and then figure out which CVs are more appropriate to a particular position or which CVs individuals should be interviewed. And the idea is that they trained this deep learning model based on the decisions of managers, previous decisions of managers, because they have history of everything. So they had a huge data set and they trained the deep learning model based on that. And, when they tested the performance on the testing data set, it looks great. It works. The performance is good. So if you treat it as a black box, you'd be very happy, and this is what you use. And this is what they used to filter out CVs until they realize at some point that the machine learning algorithm is being a bit racist. Why was it a bit racist? Well, it's not that the machine learning algorithm is racist. That's impossible. It's just that the managers that were making the decisions were biased against certain minorities, were biased against certain addresses from certain neighborhoods, and that bias was introduced into the machine learning algorithms through the training data set. And so that's one of the dangers of treating machine learning algorithms as black boxes. But this is really well beyond the scope of this course. So there's a question says, if we dig deeper, do we need to learn more about the black box instead of training it to get better accuracy? Yes, we should. But most of the time we don't. That's just, I'm admitting that most of the time we don't. We should, and there's a research field around this area where we try to figure out better ways of understanding not how accurate the machine learning algorithm is, but how is it getting the results that it's getting. So it's an active research field. Any other questions?
Hello, Professor.
Yes.
If there is some conjunction between the machine learning models during the decision level example, what will happen?
If there's a conflict between what they're saying, is that what your question is?
Yeah, if there are conflicts between the machine learning models in the decision level.
Excellent. So let's talk about that. That's the next step. That's the next slide. So how do you combine? If they don't all agree, we're going to use various ways of figuring out the result. One way is just voting, okay? Each one gets a vote, and if 3 of them vote for happy, 1 votes for sad, it's going to be happy. That's the most basic one. It's good to learn about it, but it's almost never used in practice. And the reason why it's almost never used in practice is because you get a tie. You can easily get a tie. One model says happy, one says scared, one says surprised. Which one is it? So you tend to get a lot of ties, and that's a problem. But it's a start. The other thing that we can do is voting, but weighted voting. So this is not fair voting. We're going to give different weights to different models. So if we know from our performance analysis, before we started combining all the results, before we started fusion, when we trained each model separately and tested each model separately, from our performance analysis, we'll probably figure out one model is more accurate than the other. And so we give weights to the votes. So the model that is more accurate is given let's say 1.2 votes compared to the model that is less accurate is given 0.6 votes, let's say. So we weight them depending on their accuracy. And so it's not a fair voting system, it's a weighted voting system. And that tends to generate, it's less likely to generate a tie. It's not impossible, but it's less likely to generate a tie. Another way of looking at it is to basically fuse them based on the quality of the signal. So if I know that the facial expression, the video signal was of low quality, the person was looking down, I barely got a sense of their facial expressions, well, chances are I'm not going to rely too much on facial expression. Or if I know that the person was moving a lot when I collected their EEG, and that generated all sorts of noise, and the ECG signal is noisy, I'm not going to rely a lot on the ECG signal. So that's quality aware decision fusion, level fusion. So I do voting, but I also weight them based not on the performance, but on the quality of the signal. Okay, so that's quality-based fusion. How do I assess the quality of the signal? There are a variety of ways. One way is to actually train a machine learning algorithm to assess the quality. So I would have a machine learning algorithm that looks at the ECG signal and says, oh, this is a low quality one. And so therefore, when it tries to predict emotion, when I try to predict emotions from the ECG signal, I don't rely on it as much. You can combine through a lookup table. That's even a simpler way of doing it. So using a lookup table, let's say you have two models only, just to simplify. You create a lookup table. Let's say you have M1 and M2. You create a lookup table, and this is the result. And you say, okay, when M1 said happy and M2 said sad, in my training data set, when I was training and testing, I figured that 36% of the time it was happy, and maybe 45% of the time it was sad, okay? And so that's basically an entry in my lookup table. However, when sad and happy, model 1 said sad and model 2 said happy, it was 90% of the time happy and 2% of the time, let's say, sad, and the other percentage for other emotions, okay? And so now, when I see M1 is saying happy, M2 is saying sad, well, chances are it's sad. I'll just go with the highest percentage. I'm not as so confident, but that's my best guess. When M1 is saying sad and M2 is saying happy, it was 90% of the time on my training data set, it was happy, so I'll just go with happy, okay? So that's using a lookup table.
Professor?
Yes.
What's the meaning of that percentage? That means that people have 90% is happy?
That means when model 1 said happy and or model 1 said sad and model 2 said happy, in reality, because I have a data set, right? And the training data set, it tells me what the result is. So when I'm training the machine learning algorithm, I know for a fact if the person was happy or sad, right? So when the model, let's say I'm looking at them and model 1 said sad, model 2 said happy, and the actual situation was the person was happy. Okay, so I count one for happy. Next time I look at it again and the person was sad, I count 1 for sad. And so at the end, when I do all my calculations, I see the percentage of time the person was actually happy. One model 1 was telling me sad and model 2 was telling me happy. And the percentage of time when the person was actually sad when I got this output. So I'm looking at this particular output from these two models and what happened in reality. What was the actual result?
Okay. So that percentage is there something you have known about that person?
Yes, exactly. I have it from the data. I have this data from my data set that I use for training.
Okay, got it.
Okay, so I'm almost done. I'll give you a break. We'll have a 15 minutes break in a second. I'm just want to finish the fusion. Hybrid fusion. With hybrid fusion, basically, it's just combining both because sometimes that's the most efficient way of dealing with things. Some features are somewhat similar, I can combine them, and some features are not similar and I don't want to combine them. So what I can do is do something like this. I can get features from the face, features from the hands, features from the voice, and feed all these features to a single model. So I'm doing feature level fusion for these three modalities. And then for the physiological signal, because it's very different, I just have its own model. It has its own model. And then I combine these results at the decision level. And so I am using hybrid fusion where I'm doing decision level fusion at this level because I'm fusing multiple modalities, and decision level fusion at this level because I'm fusing the outputs of two models, model 1 and model 2. Any questions about that? Okay, so let's take 15 minutes break. We'll be back, let's say 7:20. We'll finish up this set of slides and we'll start talking about image processing. So we'll be back at 7:20. Thank you.
Professor?
Yes.
I have a question about the topic for the assignment too. So
yes.
Once this class is finished, we will send you an email to choose the topic. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Need we wait for your registration email that announcement for the starting?
Yes, there's no need for the email. As soon as I say this lecture is over, then you can send me the email.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, now we're back. So, multimodal data sets. So, in order to develop machine learning algorithms, machine learning models that can assess emotions, we need data sets. Now, there are a variety of publicly available multimodal data sets. They're typically publicly available for research purposes only. So if you want to develop your own commercial product, you need to collect your own data set. The reason why these data sets exist is because it's really hard to collect a data set. And so when somebody collects a data set, what they do is they share it with the research community, as long as this data set is only used for research purposes. But there's also another advantage for having multimodal data sets, or data sets in general, and that is we can compare our work with other people's work. So if I download a data set and develop a machine learning algorithm to predict emotions from this data set, or develop an entire system to predict emotions from this data set using a multimodal approach, then I can compare my results with somebody that used the same data set. So we're comparing apples to apples. If my performance is better, I can publish a paper. If my performance is not better, then you go back to the drawing board. And so that's really how it works in research. For commercial activities, most of these data sets are not available for commercial activities. And so the company that has typically some funding will have to collect its own data set. Now we divide these data sets in effective computing into three categories: posed, induced, and spontaneous. Okay? Let's talk about these types of data sets. Posed data sets. Posed data sets are classic data sets, most of them, they've been around for a while. And this is really how we started to think about the problem of effective computing, by bringing subjects to the lab and asking them to act out emotions while the result is captured. Sometimes it used to be actors. They would bring actors. These would not be well-known actors because we cannot afford them, but actors to come to the lab and act out some emotions, and you would capture images of these emotions. The risk is that expressions are exaggerated, often exaggerated. And also, physiological signals cannot really be reliably collected because physiological signals are not being affected by how you're acting out a facial expression, right? You're not really experiencing this emotion. So the emotional state is not affected by what you're acting out. And so physiological signals cannot be used unless you hire I don't know, a method actor that really lives the role, and when you tell them be happy, they're happy, and their whole biology is telling you that they're happy. Otherwise, you're just not going to get physiological signals. So you're most likely looking at facial expressions in that case. But even the facial expressions are quite exaggerated, like these pictures that you see here. And so practically, if you develop a machine learning algorithm to detect these emotions, chances are you're going to get extremely high results. But when you apply this model practically, the model will fail miserably. Induced data set is another level where things are a little bit better with induced data sets. Here's what you do. And this is a type of data set that I've collected myself. I've never done posed data set. I think they're not very useful. But induced data set is basically when you bring subjects to the lab and you expose them to a stimulus. You're not going to scare them. You're just going to show them a video. Typically, that's what you do. You show them a video that typically evokes a certain emotion, right? A video that evokes happiness, video that evokes sadness, a really scary scene from a movie. I used to use the Saw movie. Some scenes are quite scary. And so you take video clips from different movies and that evoke certain emotions, and you use them on subjects with the hope that it evokes certain emotions. Now you're not sure, so you're going to show them the movie and then tell them, how do you feel? So they write down how do they feel. They can write it down in terms of emotional dimensions. You tell them how excited are you, how happy to sad, or how pleasant to unpleasant your feeling is. Or you can ask them to specify in terms of the 6 basic emotions. Are you surprised, sad, scared, and so forth? And so they write down how they're feeling, and hopefully you've evoked the right emotion. And if you did, you've captured their signals and you've evoked certain emotion, and it was more spontaneous. You can even collect physiological signals because they hopefully actually experienced it. And so you get a more realistic data set than the spontaneous data set. In some cases, following the stimulus, the subjects are explicitly asked to act out an emotional expression of the stimulus. This is if you really want to get clear facial expression, you show them a sad video and then you tell them, act out the emotions that you're experiencing. So they're experiencing the emotions, but they're going to act it out, so it becomes a bit exaggerated. I've never used this technique, but this technique has been used. So that's induced data set. It's good, but it's not as good as the third type, which is really where most of the research happens now. Spontaneous data set. If computers are going to be good at detecting emotions, they need to detect emotions in spontaneous situations. So with spontaneous data sets, subjects are exposed to real life stimulus, such as interaction with a machine or interaction with another human or watching a movie, a stimulus that they can be exposed to in a real life. And then what you're going to do is collect some signals from the subject, like a video, audio, maybe physiological, and then that's your data set. And you're going to use that data set to teach a machine learning algorithm to learn emotions. So you didn't really try to evoke a certain emotion. You just tell them, be yourself, talk to this person, or this person is going to interview you, or you're going to watch a movie, and just be yourself. And that's it. And then you collect this data set and you train a model to figure out emotions from this spontaneous data set. That's by far the most difficult type of data sets to work with, because emotions are very subtle, which is the case in the vast majority of our daily interactions. And so computers have to start learning subtle emotions. And so this is where you won't get results as high as 98%. You can get as high as 98 or 97% for the post data set. You're not going to get it for the spontaneous data set. This is where you start struggling. And this is where all the research happens. Any questions? So that's it for the effect modalities chapter. And we're going to move on to the next chapter, which is image processing.